Somewhere north of $500 million went into making sequels in 2026 that audiences simply refused to watch, and not bad sequels to beloved films, not risky creative swings, but franchise extensions nobody was requesting. And legacy IP dug up after decades in the ground. Desert Warrior reportedly cost $150 million and returned $700,000 at the box office. The Strangers. Chapter 3 scraped an 18% on Rotten Tomatoes and barely cleared $11 million worldwide. Greenland 2 was purchased at Cannes for $75 million by a studio that then entered bankruptcy before the film finished production. This is what happens when Hollywood mistakes nostalgia for demand. Greenland 2. Migration had one of the stranger backstories of any 2026 release before a single frame reached a screen. STX paid $75 million at the 2021 Cannes Film Festival for the worldwide distribution rights, which is a serious commitment for a sequel to a film that never played in domestic theaters. The original Greenland worked because COVID pushed it onto video on demand, where Gerard Butler running from a comet turned out to be exactly what lockdown audiences needed, and someone in a boardroom decided that meant the sequel deserved a $90 million production budget and a full theatrical push. Then STX entered bankruptcy protection, and the sequel spent years in financial limbo before eventually landing with Lionsgate. You'd think all of that chaos would register as a warning sign, but apparently nobody blinked. The film opened January 9th, 2026, across 2,710 theaters and pulled $8.4 million in its opening weekend, with a worldwide gross of $44.9 million, nominal against a $90 million production budget that excludes marketing entirely. Industry break, even on a film at this scale, sits closer to $180 million, which makes that gap genuinely brutal. Rotten Tomatoes landed at 48%, with the critical consensus essentially noting that Gerard Butler's presence keeps it watchable, but the thrills had evaporated. Here's the thing though, by June 4th, 2026, Greenland 2 was sitting at number 1 on HBO Max. The sequel that collapsed in theaters found its audience on streaming exactly as the first film had done years earlier. The studio spent $90 million chasing a theatrical hit for a franchise that demonstrably works on your couch at home, which is almost impressive in its consistency. Speaking of franchises, making expensive miscalculations, 28 years later, The Bone Temple arrived carrying serious creative credentials and still stumbled badly at the box office. Nia DaCosta directed, Ralph Fiennes starred, and Cillian Murphy reportedly appeared uncredited as Jim from the original 28 Days Later, so the pedigree was genuine. The production budget came in at $63 million, and the film earned $58 million globally in nominal terms, landing well short of the estimated $157 million break-even once marketing is factored in using a standard industry multiplier. What makes this one genuinely frustrating is that the audiences who did see it responded well, with an 88% viewer approval score on Rotten Tomatoes, suggesting the film itself was never the problem. The problem was timing. The first film in this new trilogy, simply titled 28 Years Later, hit cinemas in summer 2025 and collected $151 million globally in nominal terms, and releasing a follow-up within months of that might work for superhero franchises with built-in quarterly audiences, but for a horror franchise returning after 2 decades, it burned goodwill before it had fully accumulated. The Bone Temple will likely find its reputation on streaming, and the next sequel is reportedly still moving forward. Honestly, I hope it does, because this one deserved better numbers. There is something genuinely sad about the math here, because the film that suffered was by all accounts the stronger piece of work. That is nothing compared to the confidence required to shoot 3 films back-to-back, release them within months of each other, and watch each installment perform worse than the last. The Strangers. Chapter 3 is the logical conclusion of a strategy that probably looked bold in a pitch deck and looked very different by February 2026. Renny Harlin directed all 3 Strangers reboot films simultaneously in late 2022, completing the entire trilogy before a single audience member had seen any of them, and Chapter 3 opened February 6, 2026, lasted 4 weeks in theaters, and made somewhere between $9.3 million and $11 million worldwide in nominal terms, with Collider citing $11 million and Koimoy's earlier March figure at $9.3 million. The production budget was $8.5 million, marketing excluded, and break-even sat around $21 million, so the losses here are smaller in absolute dollar terms than Greenland 2. The 18% on Rotten Tomatoes, though, puts this in a different category of result entirely. Chapter 3 found a kind of morbid curiosity survival on Starz after its theatrical collapse, which is precisely where you end up when audiences check out of a franchise mid-trilogy. You would think releasing 3 completed films in a series would build unstoppable momentum, but the Strangers trilogy proved it can just as efficiently build an exit route for viewers looking for a reason to stop watching. One of the more effective self-defeating strategies in recent Hollywood memory. This next one is almost the opposite in terms of creative ambition, and somehow even more expensive. The Bride arrived as Maggie Gyllenhaal's follow-up to The Lost Daughter, which earned Oscar nominations and genuine critical respect, and the new film reimagines the 1935 Bride of Frankenstein intellectual property with Jessie Buckley as Ida and Christian Bale as Frankenstein. On paper, that cast and that director should produce something worth watching, and Warner Brothers clearly agreed, picking the project up after Netflix had already dropped it over budget concerns. Netflix's caution was, as it turned out, entirely prescient. The budget landed at $90 million, confirmed by multiple sources including Variety in March 2026, and the film opened to $7.3 million from 3,304 North American theaters before collecting $24 million globally in nominal terms. That represents potential losses of $66 million before a single dollar of marketing is counted, with a CinemaScore grade of C+, and a 59% on Rotten Tomatoes completing the picture. More than one piece of coverage described the film as destined to be a cult hit, which is the critical community's polite way of acknowledging the right audience simply was not at the multiplex. The uncomfortable truth is that Netflix passed, Warner Brothers committed $90 million, and the exit ramp was visible at the acquisition stage for anyone willing to look. An expensive lesson in the difference between artistic merit and commercial timing. This one is straightforward in the most bewildering possible way. Masters of the Universe, the 2026 production starring Nicholas Galitzine as He-Man, cost somewhere between $170 million and $200 million, according to Far Out Magazine's June 2026 reporting, and collected around $104 million at the global box office in nominal terms, leaving a shortfall that is staggering even at the low end of the budget estimate. The original Masters of the Universe from 1987 starred Dolph Lundgren cost a fraction of what the 2026 version spent, and was not exactly a towering commercial achievement either, so the new film was building on a foundation that was never particularly solid to begin with. The main audience complaint centered on underwhelming visual effects, which is a genuinely remarkable thing to hear about a film that reportedly cost $200 million, because you'd think at some price point, the CGI stops being the criticism. Apparently not. A sequel is reportedly in development despite the financial results, which suggests either genuine confidence in the franchise or a contractual obligation nobody has publicly discussed. Galitzine committed to the role, and that much is clear from the footage. Whether the role deserved a $200 million commitment from the studio is a separate question, and the box office answered it with considerable clarity. This one deserves a different tone entirely, because there is genuine pathos in a 14-year development journey ending this way. Andy Serkis spent over a decade trying to bring a feature film version of Animal Farm to a mainstream audience, with the project first announced in 2012, Netflix eventually attaching and then walking away, and Angel Studios ultimately picking it up for a 2026 wide release. The reported production budget was $35 million, and the film earned approximately $5.5 million domestically in nominal terms according to comicbook.com, with Far Out Magazine citing $6.3 million, the discrepancy likely reflecting different counting windows. Animal Farm played for 35 days and made the bulk of its money in the first 10. The creative decision that did the most damage was replacing Napoleon, the ruthless political villain voiced by Seth Rogen, with a new original character named Lucky, a young piglet voiced by Gaten Matarazzo, in what amounted to a complete reframing of the source material. George Orwell's Allegory works precisely because it is unsparing, and softening it into a coming-of-age story with an invented protagonist removes the thing that makes the original worth adapting in the first place. 14 years of effort, $35 million, Seth Rogen on the poster, and the film still could not hold an audience past its opening weekend, with potential losses exceeding $29 million before marketing. Sometimes the bravest creative decision is trusting the source material. For sheer scale of financial loss relative to box office return, nothing in 2026 comes close to Desert Warrior. Reported at $150 million, this may be the most expensive film Saudi Arabia has ever produced, starring Anthony Mackie, Ben Kingsley, and Aisha Hart in a story set in 7th century Arabia with Rupert Wyatt directing. Filming wrapped in 2022, and the film then sat in post-production for roughly 4 years before hitting wide release in late April 2026. Desert Warrior made just over $700,000 worldwide in nominal terms, played in American theaters for 2 weeks, and landed at 26% on Rotten Tomatoes. Sit with that math for a moment. A $150 million production returned $700,000 at the box office, which works out to less than half of 1% of the budget recovered theatrically. For context, Greenland 2, which was a significant flop by any normal measure, still returned 50% of its production budget at the box office. Desert Warrior returned less than 0.5%. The film was clearly built to signal Saudi Arabia's arrival as a serious filmmaking force on the world stage, and what it signaled instead was that building an industry requires more than a budget. An audience needs a reason to show up, and no level of spending manufactures that from scratch. The pattern connecting all 7 of these films is worth stating plainly. Studios keep mistaking the presence of an intellectual property, a franchise title, or a respected director for evidence of audience demand. Greenland 2 was purchased at Cannes for $75 million before anyone confirmed audiences wanted a sequel. The Strangers trilogy was shot in its entirety before Chapter 1 had screened for a single viewer. The Bride was greenlit at $90 million after Netflix had already said no. The box office does not process internal studio logic. It only measures whether enough people want to leave the house, and in 2026, for these 7 films, the answer was a consistent and expensive no. At least 3 of these films will find second lives on streaming over the next 18 months, develop genuine followings, and get quietly described as underappreciated in a few years' time. That will not recover a single dollar of the losses, but it will make for a great retrospective video. The pattern of studios spending enormous money on sequels nobody requested, and the streaming platforms that quietly inherit those audiences afterward, is exactly the kind of story this channel keeps tracking.